All right, good morning, everybody. So I hope you had a good Thanksgiving break. So about that quiz, I have to admit I sort of forgot to post a quiz. So my mistake. And then I was eating Thanksgiving dinner, and I was slightly in a coma from all the turkey, and then I thought, I can't possibly submit a quiz now. This is probably not the right time, so just no quiz. And right now you're probably focusing on the final exam, so I think we're good with the quizzes. So any question before we start? The last week of class? Yes? Sorry? It's not cumulative, so it's just the last 5 lectures, and so it covers development and what else? Language. Yes. Okay. All right. So now for something very different, we talked about cognitive development, and we talked throughout the course a lot about cognition, but now we talk about social and emotional development. And of course these are somewhat related. Without cognition, it's hard to understand what somebody else is feeling or thinking. And probably without emotional and social development, it's hard to get good cognitive development. So one of the most amazing phenomena is the development of an attachment bond between an infant from the moment of birth and the primary caregiver, usually the mother. And with attachment here we mean a strong, enduring emotional bond between two individuals. And as I said, this starts from birth, so this is between the infant and the caregiver, and it's often the mother. So one of the first goals of an infant is, of course, to identify who the primary caregiver is. And animals and humans differ in this respect. Human infants are very fragile. They are not physically very well developed as, let's say, some infant animals. And so they can't easily sort of cling on to a parent. They can't do what monkeys do, right? So be carried along with the mother all the time. And so they have to use social cues and emotional cues to signal their desires and their intent. So babies are very good at using facial expressions, and they're also surprisingly good at reading facial expressions from the caregiver. And so from a very early age, infants are interested in face-to-face interaction. They definitely keep track of what how the caregiver responds and who is responding in the first place. They keep a mental tally of the various people that are around, who's the most responsive in various situations. Now, a very interesting phenomenon is social referencing. So when infants are able to explore their environment and they start to crawl around, they inevitably will encounter some tricky situations, potentially dangerous situations, like climbing down the stairs, for example, or grabbing for some toy, or something that looks edible and they stick it in their mouth. But what their behavior is not completely random. And they will look, in cases of uncertainty, they will look to the primary caregiver for assurance or information. And this phenomenon is called social referencing. So they look at facial cues of the caregiver to see if their behavior is appropriate or inappropriate. And so we know about social referencing from some studies using this visual cliff apparatus. Now in this apparatus, this was first used to study depth perception in infants. So they're crawling over some checkerboard patterns. And then they approach this visual cliff where they have to use depth perception to realize that it's a cliff in the first place. And researchers figured out that yes, infants, they do have depth perception. They will stop in front of this visual cliff. Now note that this is actually not a dangerous situation because this apparatus is covered by plexiglass, so even if they do go forward, they don't fall down. But what's of interest is what happens when this infant inevitably stops in front of this visual cliff. They look up and they look at let's say it's the mother who's around, and if the mother looks fearful or angry, the infant will definitely not cross. But if the mother looks approvingly and happy, then the infant will continue on its march forward. So as the development continues, at about 6 to 8 months of age, the bond between the infant and caregiver becomes sufficiently strong that they become very upset once they're separated from their caregiver. And this is a very normal process. It peaks around 18 months or 1.5 years of age. And so researchers like Bowlby, they hypothesized that what's going on here is that infants, they have this need for contact comfort. They just don't see the caregiver as just satisfying some biological needs necessarily, but they need the caregiver for psychological comfort as a way to feel safe in terms of exploring their environment, to use their caregiver as a secure base. So one question is, where do these bonds, these attachment bonds, where do they come from? So one can focus on the obvious survival value. Human infants especially can't survive on their own, unlike some animals. So clearly, hanging on to an adult makes sort of biological sense. It has a survival value. And related to that, some animals have this imprinting behavior, where they form bonds very quickly based on biological processes. Another reason why an attachment bond might form is based on reinforcement. The caregiver is the person who provides food. So maybe the bond is just based on reinforcements. Maybe the caregiver is just a means of getting food, and that's what an attachment bond sort of involves. But a lot of researchers, as we'll discuss in the next couple of slides, they talk about the importance of psychological comfort, going beyond just basic needs. So what's very interesting that for some animals, there is this critical period where an attachment bond forms. So for ducks, for example, the first 12 hours of their existence, they open up this sort of critical window where anything that moves in sight and is present during this period of time, that object or person or animal will be imprinted. And this is an amazing finding by what is going on here? Stop. And this was found by Konrad Lorenz, who studied animals in their natural environment. And he did some interesting experiments where he was present during the birth of these ducklings. And these ducklings, they followed him around everywhere where he went. And this can lead to sort of interesting, funny situations where this duckling in this little video is following his dog around. I don't know the background of this video, but I think this dog was the first thing the duckling saw, and so the dog is now imprinted in this duckling's mind. So it looks kind of cute, but this is probably a disastrous scenario for this duckling. This can't be possibly good for this person. So humans don't have imprinting. You don't have to worry that you have to see your baby. Yeah, this is kind of cute. Can be healthy though. All right. All right. So there's no such phenomenon of imprinting in people. It's not entirely clear why, but babies are probably clever enough to figure out who the caregiver is. They have the capacity to form mental representations, and so they can learn who will take care of them, as opposed to animals that might not have the ability to learn these things as quickly. Now, just as an aside, because I found the whole phenomenon of imprinting very interesting, and this is admittedly a little tangential to the whole story, but documentary makers, they exploit this whole phenomenon of imprinting to make documentaries of animals up close. So here's a little video clip of this person who was able to record ducks' flight patterns very up close using this imprinting phenomenon.
He wanted to capture what it's like to be a bird. That meant flying with one.
Nope.
So he trained a duck from the time its egg hatched to think of him as its father.
You were the daddy of the duck. I was the dad. I was young, I had to take it to the office. It came there, it was growing up, it would be in the car when I was driving along. It would eat at dinner parties. I always had to go everywhere with this duck.
Eventually, he took the duck in his camera 200 feet up in a parachute. He had never flown before.
And when we were up at altitude, I released this duck, and within a few seconds, it formated next to me and was flying alongside me, literally a foot away from my head.
John, you flew with a duck.
One of my first flying experiences was flying with a duck.
Again, sort of an interesting aside. All right, so clearly the caregiver serves a survival purpose and can increase the chances of survival. But beyond that, the caregiver might provide food, and maybe that's the reason why an attachment bond forms. If the infant realizes the person is close, is giving me food, maybe that reinforces the attachment bond. But Harlow did some classic experiments that suggested that the attachment bond goes well beyond just serving basic biological needs. And he did experiments that you can't do with humans, but he did them with monkeys, and they were very suggestive. So he had this setup where he had monkeys in this cage, and he provided two surrogate sort of mothers, if you will, made from wire. One wire monkey provided food, that's the one here on the left. And one wire monkey did not provide food, but was covered with this terry cloth, so it was more comfortable to cling to. And to his surprise, he found that these monkeys very much preferred to hang out with the terry cloth surrogate mother, and only when they were very, very hungry did they jump to the other side to get food. And the conclusion here is that the bonds really are not based on just reinforcement learning based on food needs, but it goes well beyond it, and it's based on psychological comfort. So I want to show you a video of what happens eventually with some of those Harlow monkeys. They actually didn't fare so well because even though this monkey or the surrogate mother was preferred, neither of these sort of options provided any guidance on how to behave in social situations. So these monkeys actually did very poorly when they were released in more natural circumstances. So I want to show you a very brief clip.
Psychologist Harlow continued where Kellogg had left off.
Harlow's work was really seminal in this entire field because he showed the crucial importance of the caregiving relationship between a mother and an infant, and how the physical stimulation, literally the physical contact with the caregiver, has profound impact on health and development.
Harlow took newborn baby monkeys from their mothers. He gave them a choice between a cold wire monkey with milk or a soft warm monkey without. They chose comfort above food every time. Socially, the effects of this experiment were devastating. Raised in isolation, without any love or encouragement, the young monkeys were scared and confused. Here was proof that early isolation doesn't bring the life. But these were monkeys. Would the same be true for a human child? 20 years later, scientists had a chance to find out.
So yes, comfort is important, but also all these, the rich social experience that a mother can provide, that's essential for later social and emotional development. So Bowlby took all these findings from Konrad Lorenz and from Harlow and developed this theory of attachment. And so he proposed that caregivers serve as a secure base from which infants can explore. And critically, he proposed that from a very early age, infants start to develop an internal working model about typical responses of a caregiver. Now, an internal working model is related to the notion of a schema that we talked about in the context of memory research. And so, if you will, an internal working model is like a schema for social and emotional expectations. What does a caregiver do if I'm crying, let's say? What is a typical response? Does the caregiver respond to me, or does the caregiver sort of go away? And Bowlby argued that these internal working models, that they're formed and that they're carried with the infant, and it develops or sets the expectations for later life as well. So Bowlby argued that there are all these differences between infants based on their internal working models, that different infants can come up with different expectations. But he didn't sort of qualify what those differences are. Mary Ainsworth was a colleague of Bowlby, and she tried to classify the different kinds of attachment styles that infants form based on these expectations. So she developed this classic experiment called the strange situation. And in this experiment, there are a number of phases. In the classic setup, there's a child with the parent in some room where they can be observed. Then a stranger enters, and the stranger might interact a little bit with the parent. Then the parent leaves the room, leaving the child alone with the caregiver. And then the parent comes back into the room, and the stranger leaves. And actually, in the classic setup, this process is repeated again, where the stranger enters again, the parent leaves the room, and they come back. And what's of importance here is what does the child do during these various phases of the experiment? So when the caregiver is with the child, how much does the child explore their environment? Does the child use the parent as a secure base? When the stranger comes in, does the child look at the caregiver and use social referencing to get some guidance of what he or she should do with respect to this stranger? Does the child cry when the parent leaves? And very important, how does the child respond when the parent comes back into the room? Is the child happy? Can the child be happily exploring their environment again, or are they just very fussy and hard to hard to please. So I want to show you a video that shows a number of these different kinds of responses that Ainsworth classified into different attachment styles. And I should note that this is not the classic strange situation. There's no stranger actually entering the room. This is just the parent and the child interacting. The parent leaves and then parent comes back. It's as simple as that.
Every voice is studying Harlow about childhood experiences influenced by behavior that this experiment, which I watched through a two-way mirror, is designed to gauge how secure is the crucial relationship between mother and child.
Has been established in studies that would watch a child 1-year-old and then follow it up and interview about their relationships to their parents when they were 21 years old. We're quite confident in the long-term significance of this relationship.
After several minutes play, the mother is signaled to leave the room. The key element in the experiment is the child's reaction to her mother's return.
The important clue is whether the baby is able to become calmed down by the contact with the mother back to play. Sometimes it takes a couple of minutes. You see, when the mother was out, she was only interested in the mother, no interest in the toys. Now she has a contact with her mother. She's beginning to show a little interest in the environment, and shortly she'll be right back with the toys all this time.
So you would call this a secure one?
Yes. Now, this is an insecure baby. We got the measure of the baby's play before the separation. When the mother leaves, the baby cries, goes to the door following her. Now, we sent the mother right back in, and the point is not to distress the baby, we're just trying to challenge it. The baby puts her hands to her face, in a sad expression, puts her face down. When she picks her up, she keeps her head down, her arms out, and then she sits in the chair holding the baby. The baby's still sullen. And he's low key.
So you would call this insecure?
Insecure, he's avoidant. He's not engaging her, and it's not, the reunion is not effective. And it's important to remember here that the thing that upset him was her absence. Her return should be the solution to his problem. This is another pattern that we see in babies who are not good at using their mother as a secure base. At home, this baby is also insecure. But you'll see, we've got a look at his play before the separation. The mother's left. When she returns, she picks him up. He can't calm down. He's still upset. She offers a toy to amuse him, to comfort him, or to distract him, and he slaps it away. She offers another, he slaps it away. He's angry. The cause babies resistant or ambivalent because they both want her back and yet can't use the contact. We think that the difficulty is that in the past, when he sought comfort, she's been inconsistent to whether she's available and responsive or not.
All right. So you've seen a number of different attachment styles as classified by Ainsworth. So one style is this secure attachment bond, where the child happily explores the room when the parent is there, cries when the parent leaves, that's very normal, but then is happy again when the parent returns and will explore and play with some toys again when the mother returns. And then there are three insecure attachment styles. There's avoidant, ambivalent, or resistant, and disorganized and disoriented style. The last one was not shown in the video. So this avoidant style, essentially the infant is just not very responsive, or doesn't really seem to react very much to the parent, and doesn't seem to care very much when the parent is around, and doesn't seem to care very much when the parent leaves. Now the resistant or ambivalent style, that's when the child might loudly protest when the parent leaves, but then might still protest when the parent returns. Might still be extremely fussy and might be hard to please. And the disorganized and disoriented style, the last one, that's sort of the other category. It's hard to understand what's going on there, but there's no sort of any consistent pattern in which the infant and parent are interacting with each other. And it's often thought that this might be due to some mental disorders in the family, where the child really has no clue of what's going on. The parent might be depressed, or there might be some other mental disorder going on. The last pattern is much more rare. So we talked about these different attachment styles. So one question is, where do they come from? What causes these differences in attachment bonds? So one cause might be just the experience that a child has with their parent. It might also be due to cultural differences, still based on experiences, but set in a broader framework of culture. And finally, there might also be differences in biology, and there might be an issue of temperament that's innate. So first, in terms of experiences, one theory says that children just keep very close track and develop these internal working models of how the primary caregiver responds in times of need. So a secure infant might have learned that the parent is available when needed and will respond to them in moments of distress. And they might feel therefore comfortable at exploring the environment. And they know they can go back when they feel threatened. A anxious or, let's go back, an avoidant child might have learned that the parent is simply not responsive. The parent is just not emotionally available, might not respond to their needs, and so might avoid the caregiver in many situations and doesn't seem to care when the caregiver comes back. Now the tricky one to understand is the resistant or ambivalent attachment style. And it is thought that this is based on inconsistent parenting experiences. Sometimes the parent might be needed, but the parent is simply not there, is not emotionally available. And so the child learns that sometimes the parent is just not there. On the other hand, the parent might go overboard and be very available when it's not needed, right? For example, interrupting play and cuddling when the child doesn't want to be cuddled. And so then the child is not quite sure what to make of the situation, of these inconsistencies in parenting approaches. And that leads to great uncertainty. That's the theory at least. So they are very fussy when the parent leaves, and they're still fussy when the parent comes back, and they're hyper-vigilant about where the parent is at all times, because they're never quite sure what the parent will do. Now, another cause of these attachment styles might be based on cultural differences. So again, based on the nurture side, it's ultimately based on experiences, but experience is set in this broader framework of culture. So there are very interesting differences in cultures on should you leave your infant alone. Some cultures that's a big taboo, in other cultures it's more normal. For example, this picture here on the lower right, this is from Copenhagen in Denmark. It's quite normal there to leave your child outside while the parents are shopping in a shopping center or they're eating dinner. This would be a big no-no in the US. And in fact, a Danish couple that did this in New York City, they were arrested when they put their baby outside. But it's perfectly normal in Denmark. And the idea is, well, your baby can air out a little bit. And, another big sort of difference is whether you sleep with your children when after first born. And this is a big dilemma for parents. This is very stressful. You want to get your own sleep, but on the other hand, you want to be there when your baby needs you. So in some cultures, like in Norway, some African cultures, mothers always sleep with their babies. In the US, it's a little bit less common. There's one side, sort of one parenting style emphasizes the idea of Ferberizing. And Ferberizing is the idea that they should just cry it out. You just don't sleep with your baby. When they start to cry, you don't respond, because if you respond, then they will cry even more, and they just, just let them sort it out themselves. So there are vast individual differences, or cultural differences, and you can observe the consequences of these cultural differences if you look at the propensity of these different attachment styles in different countries. So in the United States, there are many securely attached infants, which is good, and there's a lower propensity of avoidant and ambivalent styles. In Japan, interestingly, there's almost no infant that will be classified as avoidant. And the explanation here is that in Japan, children are never left alone. So the parent is always there, right? They always are responsive to some degree, and so you don't get this avoidant behavior. In Germany, Germany has much more of this let's children figure this out themselves kind of attitude. So when children cry, the parent might just say, well, you sort it out yourself, might not always be responsive, and this leads to a much higher propensity of these avoidant infants. And this pattern for Israel is somewhat curious. There's a lot of ambivalence in Israel. It's not quite clear what the explanation is. One explanation focuses on the role of daycare. Parents work a lot more, or both parents might be working. So infants get these experiences from a lot of different people, and they're not quite sure who exactly their primary caregiver is. All right, so another difference that might explain these attachment styles might be based on biology. Some kids might just be naturally fussy. And fussy kids are just harder to deal with, so parents have a harder time to respond to their needs. If your child is happy and sociable, it's much easier to be responsive. If your child is generally fearful of a lot of things, including irrational things, you can't always be responsive to your child. So maybe that can explain some differences as well. And so there's a lot of interesting research on temperament, the differences, sort of these innate differences in temperament, and how they progress throughout life. So I want to show you a video by Kagan that shows these very strong initial differences, but that might actually fade away later in life. As Kagan argues, it's the parent that can actually control to some degree the influence of temperament and then what happens with a fearful child or with a happy and social child. So let's show this video. Oh.
Scientists are finding evidence that some children are actually born.
Sorry, the video, maybe the audio, let's see. Does this matter?
Scientists are finding evidence that some children are actually born.
One more time.
It all began 15 years ago when Harvard psychologist Jerome Kagan launched a new study on childhood behavior.
I started to gather data like on the tape of 4-month-old infants, and over a period of a week I looked at these tapes very carefully, and to my surprise I saw these high and low reactive infants. They were just so different. If you study infants for as long as I have, then when you see those two types, you know you're seeing something very important.
What Kagan discovered was that about 20% of the infants were upset by even the slightest stimulation, while another 20% reacted passively to the same tests. Kagan dubbed these children high and low reactive.
You have been a very good baby today.
For these high reactive children, Kagan's team found that anything new, like the sound of a stranger's voice, upset them dramatically. And Kagan found that these differences in temperament continued as the children grew. For example, this infant, named Blair, who was unafraid of the tests, grew into a curious 2-year-old eager to explore this unfamiliar room. Years later, at age 4, Blair continued to be unfazed by new situations.
Tear off my favorite
But for Lisa, who cried at the stranger's voice, the story was very different. As a 2-year-old, she was frightened by strange places and clung to her mother for security. Over time, Lisa continued to develop into a shy and apprehensive child.
Here's our high reactive infant. Here she is at 4.5 years of age, and she has to make a mark in a book. Notice how quiet, notice how tense she sits. She doesn't look at the examiner. Now she's asked to pour some liquid on the table. She does it, no laughter. This is not a joke.
But what role do parents have in shaping how these children develop? Surprisingly, research with monkey families is offering some clues.
The monkeys are closely related to humans. They share over 94% of the genes that humans have, and they have the same basic emotions, and more importantly, the same basic underlying physiological processes that sustain and support these emotions.
Like human children, some monkeys are born high reactive and are easily frightened by new surroundings, while other infant monkeys are more inquisitive and outgoing. Sumi hopes to understand just how important parenting and environment are to shaping these infants through the years. So he performed an experiment that wouldn't be possible with humans. He switched parents and children. By placing shy infants with outgoing parents and vice versa, he's made an important discovery.
What we found is that no matter what an individual's genetic endowment is, what kind of behavior its mother shows to her can make a big difference in how it will grow up and how it will cope with the day-to-day stresses and challenges of the complex social life that's characteristic of these mothers.
So even though genetics can influence an infant's personality at birth, over time, parenting and environment actually play a stronger role. Even infants born fearful can be transformed by nurturing surroundings. And the study of human children is finding the same results. Here's the once shy and fearful Lisa, now age 7.
She's not as shy as she was earlier, and as a matter of fact, she is overcoming her shyness. See, she talks, she smiles, she talks to her mother. So this is quite a remarkable change.
Kagan's quick to stress that in spite of their shyness, these children will lead perfectly normal lives. His findings suggest general paths children may follow as their personalities develop.
How are you today?
Most children will look like average children. It's the extremes. It's going to be hard for a high-reactive infant to be David Letterman, very difficult for a low-reactive infant to be TSO.
Yeah, so this video suggests that there's a strong influence of biology in terms of temperament, but that nurture in terms of parents can overcome some of these differences. And as we'll see later, there's some researcher who strongly disagrees with that. All this research so far is focused very much on the influence of parents on the development, the social and emotional development of kids. And as we'll see at the very end, there are some researchers who say that that's very much overrated. But there is clearly an association between these early initial differences in attachment styles and later social and emotional development. So securely attached infants, they will have a more positive development later on as they enter preschool and kindergarten. They tend to be more positive in their emotional expressions. They are more positively evaluated by peers, show more helping behaviors, etc. There's a lot of positive outcomes early on in school. Now, what's interesting as you look at longitudinal studies and you follow these individuals over a long period of time, these infants that were classified as secure, they tend to have more satisfying relationships later on in life. They tend to have more happy, more stable, romantic relationships, whereas the anxious, avoidant infants, they're less interested in romantic relationships later on. So this suggests that whatever explains these initial differences in different attachment bonds, they could be very stable over time and work throughout adult life. But there's a danger here in attributing sort of a causal effect here. It's possible that these attachment styles and these expectations, these initial sort of working models, that they drive these good outcomes, that they cause the good outcomes later on in life. But it's quite possible that there are confounding factors at play. Maybe a person who has a secure attachment maybe is associated with a secure parent. Maybe they're better socioeconomic background, and that is the explanation for later good outcomes in life. Now, we can't do experiments on humans to manipulate, whether an infant's secure or not. So it's hard to tell what the ultimate causal explanation is. So another interesting dimension, we talked about sort of differences in infants. There's also many interesting differences in parents. Here's a classification style or classification scheme to sort of think about parenting styles in 4 different ways. You can think about parenting styles in terms of how controlling or how demanding they are, in terms of very demanding versus less demanding. And you can also look at the dimension of how accepting, how responsive parents are to the child's needs. So one parenting style called the authoritarian style, the parent is basically setting a lot of rules, but is not explaining the rules because the child is supposed to just obey the parent, and that's what the child has to do. And so the parent here is not really very responsive to the child's needs. On the other hand, the permissive parent sets, almost by definition, very few rules and demands, and lets the child sort of make their own decisions. Then the uninvolved parent is too busy to do anything, so has no time to set any demands, and is also too busy to respond to the child's needs. And then finally, what a lot of people think is the best parenting style, the one that leads to the best outcomes, is an authoritative parenting style, where the parent does set rules, does set demands, but also explains the rules. So it's not just do what I told you to do, but do it because here's the reason. You might feel better if you do your homework or if you listen to me, blah, blah, blah. And so it's very responsive to the child's needs, but also sets clear boundaries. There's some disagreement exactly about what the best parenting style is. It might not work universally for all kinds of kids. The authoritative parenting style works well for middle upper class families, Caucasian children. With other backgrounds, other parenting styles, permissive or authoritarian styles, might work better. And this is where we need to do more research. So we talked a lot about parents and the influence that parents have on the social and emotional development of kids. But there's one radical researcher called Judith Harris, and she basically threw a wrench in this whole field. She suggested that the influence of parents is vastly overestimated. She says that sometimes it looks like a parent or the parent's behavior and a child's behavior are very related. Like a happy parent produces a happy child, or an avoidant, uninvolved parent produces this avoidant attachment style. But she would argue that part of this is just genetics, and they're often not controlled in studies that look at these correlations. But she also says, very importantly, that it's of course the nurture side is very important, but the experience is not given so much by parents, it's given by peers. Parents just, they have some influence, but not as much as people think. So I want to show you a brief clip talking about Harris's views, which are controversial and not accepted by a lot of people. Oops. Why is it jump?
I'm free to look as an outsider at what the establishment has been producing and saying, hey, you guys, you've been calling your old noses too long.
She says, look at your own evidence with new eyes. Take twin studies. Here are Debbie Melman and Sharon Cosette, separated at birth, adopted, and raised by two different sets of parents in two separate households. Reunited just a couple of years ago, they turned out, well, hard to tell apart.
You're standing here, and you're there, but your boy knows you're not there. Twins who are split up are just as similar in personality as twins who are reared together. And that can't really be explained by the idea that the home environment is what, makes you turn out the way you are.
What does determine what sort of adult you are?
Well, that's a very good question. Part of the answer is genes. We've always known that. But the question is, what besides genes makes people turn out the way they do?
Parents believe children are molded by the people they hang out with, the kids, the peer group.
I believe that human beings are designed by evolution to adapt to a group and to become a accepted and valuable member of a group. And this was the child's goal almost from the beginning. What they have to do is to look for a group of people that are like themselves, figure out how that group of people acts, and child tries to adapt his or her behavior to the behavior of the group.
Parents say this adaptation is evident in immigrant families. The Jobs came from China 12 years ago, but mom and dad haven't been able to master any English. Not so the children. Harris says they don't just speak the language, they do it with very little trace of an accent. And that proves that children adapt to the group. One of the most influential linguists in this country agrees with her. Chairman of psychology at MIT, Steven Pinker.
Kids are acutely sensitive to the fine nuances of what other kids are saying, and the way that parents talk makes no difference.
Pinker regards the Harris book as a turning point in the history of psychology.
What Harris is simply saying is get rid of the illusion that you can mold your child like silly putty, that how you treat your child is going to determine the kind of grown-up they become.
Harris hit upon her theory almost by accident, reading a study about adolescents who commit minor crimes, which concluded that youngsters acted out because they were trying to be like adults.
And I said, wait a minute, teenagers aren't doing these stupid things because they want to be like adults. If they wanted to be like adults, they'd be doing boring things like figuring out their taxes or sorting the laundry. They're trying to show that they can thumb their noses at adult customs and rules. And that gave me the idea that teenagers identified with a group called teenagers.
She quotes studies on teenage smoking that found that kids took up a habit not because their parents smoked, but because their friends did. When I asked 8th graders at Baldwin Middle School on Long Island who they thought had more influence, it set off another debate.
My friends, because they're going to be out in the world with me, not my parents.
Friends, because you're around the norm and your family.
Your parents didn't support the foundation of how you act, but you get more experience from your friends.
I think my parents are influencing me because they've had more experience.
Parents teach you big things, right and wrong, and stuff like that, and your friends teach you little things, they keep building up, because they teach you a lot.
Dr. Alan Soroke at the University of Minnesota has dedicated his career to studying parents and their children. He says Harris just ignores evidence that contradicts her theory, including his work.
There's been research for 30 years showing that what peers primarily influence are superficial aspects of behavior. How you dress, music preferences, slang vocabulary, hairstyles, makeup styles. But what parents influence more, your basic moral character, your values, your conscience.
One of the things that immediately comes to mind is these kids in Oregon, Mississippi, Arkansas, who shoot their classmates. And we usually jump to the conclusion that something was wrong at home.
We should not jump to that conclusion. I think this is a terrible tragedy for the parents of these children, and that they deserve our compassion and not to be blamed. What I notice about these children is that very often they've been rejected by their peers, and that they're unhappy for that reason.
Do you feel that it's more critical that the child adapt well in the peer group than that the child be happy at home?
In the long run, yes.
Yeah, so this debate has not settled yet. And so in a nutshell, she argues that parents don't have a long-term effect on the development of the child's personality and social, emotional development. And like the video made very clear, that the child's peer group is much more important. And yeah, all these issues are very important when you think about your own role as a parent. How much can you influence your child's development? What should you try to influence? And just as a side note, when Judith Harris did this research, she was actually not affiliated with a university. She did this research at home, which is quite impressive. And then she published her research in Psych Review, which is one of the best journals in psychology. And so her affiliation is Middletown, New Jersey. So for those of you who want to publish, but you're not at a university, you can publish too. So that's it for today, and I'll see you for the last class on Thursday.